you talked about how Henry was uh, trying various different strategies out. Strategy might be a bit of a grandiose term, but he was trying out different ways in which to um, uh, consolidate influence, perhaps diminish influence that he thought was negatively affecting him and his regime. Uh, so that's a lot of the top-down stuff going on with the elite level, our monarchy looking over the continent, going, any influence comes from there. Let's make sure I remain the heads of this nation, and we don't have any agitators, as it were. But let's start delving into some of the impacts on those around the monasteries, because you mentioned just how embedded the monasteries were within public life, and in many cases, as you pointed out in your book, is settlements sprung up around the monasteries. Monasteries are often the first thing there, and people came to live in their shadow, and sometimes that wasn't the case. So when you look back at history and you say that we see 18th, 19th, 20th century anti-Catholic sentiment forming, that clearly couldn't have always been the case, insofar that Henry himself still considered himself Catholic. He was a defender of the faith, the Catholic faith, and I would imagine most people in the country were also, until such point as later reforms, Church of England, all those things that started to change the national religion. So how did people on the ground respond to the closure of monasteries, and how did it impact their day-to-day lives?
So ultimately, it impacts people enormously. I do think it needs to be understood, though, that we must step away from that retrospective position that, of course, distorts our assessment of how people living through this experience would have understood it. That we know that by the beginning of the 1540s, all of these institutions have gone. They have been closed down. But those living in the 1530s do not. And even in the early weeks of 1540, when there are still a number of monasteries, some of the most ancient and some of the largest in the country, some of those that provide the staff for the great cathedrals, they are still functioning in the first weeks of 1540, and so people's response to dissolution is as incremental as the process itself. That people by the later 1540s, 1550s are beginning to process what this means. But it is a slow process, I think. And there are, in the short term, as many continuities as there are discontinuities. And the people of Henry VIII's England, I think, are not, in one respect at least, not hugely different from those in later centuries, in that what tends to affect people first and foremost, of course, are those things most directly connected to their livelihood. And some of those things do not change very quickly. So if you were a tenant of a monastery property, you're, in most cases, in the years immediately following the dissolution, the terms of your tenancy don't change. All that's changed is that remote landlord that you may never have had a relationship with anyway. That landlord is now the crown, not the monastery. But what we know from the documentation that survives is that the crown was not, generally speaking, interfering with the terms of tenancies. In other words, people didn't suddenly find themselves the day after the monks trooped out of the monastery, find themselves paying more rent. Rents were not raised immediately. Often the officials looking after these tenanted properties were the same people who'd been doing it for the monastic landlord, and they're now doing it for the crown. So there's a great deal of continuity, particularly surrounding those aspects that really do affect people's livelihood, where they live, what they do. Those most affected in the short term are those who were employed by monasteries. And there is no doubt that they are displaced and suffer a discontinuity in their livelihood, in how they derive income. And a good many of them do petition the crown for compensation, for honouring of contracts that seem to have been suddenly broken. Some of them find themselves not being adequately compensated because they weren't able to prove what role they had as a domestic servant or some other employee of the monastery. They are a reasonably substantial part of the population. We think that, although we don't have comprehensive records, that for every monk or nun in a religious house, there may be as many as 3 employees. So if there are between 10 and 12,000 monks and nuns in Henry VIII's England, then there could be easily 3 times as many people who are employed by them. That's a substantial group of people, although in a population that is rising from around 2.5 million, it's not an astonishing number of the population. But that's the sort of scale of those who are immediately affected. But still, there are other immediate continuities. The male monastics who come out of monasteries, a significant proportion of them go on to minister as in churches nearby. And so if within the neighborhood there were those who were strongly attached to the forms of religious practice seen in monasteries, even there is a kind of continuity, because they may now be going to their parish church rather than into the precinct of the monastery to worship in the monastery church. And there, at the end of the nave, they will find a minister who is in fact a former monk or a former friar. So there are visible changes. These precincts with a great monastic church in the middle of them, which were places of employment and places of settled residence for employees and so on, they have fallen silent and they have fallen empty. But woven around that sudden change and very visible change and audible change is a great deal of continuity. And very significant change unfolds only slowly. One of the striking realizations, I think, of more recent years of research, archaeological research as much as archival research, has been to show us that the dissolution doesn't mean the immediate demolition of lots of buildings. That the ruined, broken arches and tumbled buildings that we associate with this process and which we've lovingly preserved in rural settings, they are something that would have only become familiar to most people across the country 50, 80, 100 years after the dissolution. A great many of these buildings are, in the immediate term, maintained. They may be empty. What Henry VIII's subjects would have been familiar a bit with was the sort of mothballing of buildings rather than the tearing down of buildings. And I think I'd make one other point about how this impacts in the short term on the wider population. I think something else that we understandably in our own time perhaps struggle to remind ourselves of is that these are people who were familiar with discontinuity. I think it's something perhaps in the modern psyche, perhaps especially for those of us who, fortunately for us, were born and have lived long after the experiences of the mid-20th century, that we are not just unfamiliar, most of us, certainly in Britain, with major and unsettling discontinuity, but we are, I think we perhaps don't acknowledge it, but we're very fearful of it. And we forget that discontinuity, change, was normal, and that even ancient foundations, ancient institutions shut down. People were, in Henry VIII's England, were familiar with the idea that there might be a church that is abandoned or turned into something else. They had seen institutions being recycled repeatedly. They were familiar with not just institutional buildings such as churches and colleges and schools and almshouses being changed from one thing into another, but they'd seen it with whole settlements. And so we have, if we want to understand what this process meant to contemporaries, in many ways, I think that needs to be the starting point. That what we understand as normal, stable life is shaped and informed by living in the first decades of the 21st century, not by the standards of the 1530s, and we really need to overcome that gap. I think just as if we want to understand the outlook of those living in post-war Britain, we have to place ourselves in the perspective of those who for 6 years became familiar with bombed out streets and so on. Now, Henry VIII's England is not living with destruction on that scale, but certainly change was as familiar to these people as continuity.